Welcome all to the fifth event of our 75th year anniversary of diplomatic relations between Iceland and Canada series. The first one in the series was on Canada-Iceland Arctic research cooperation. Then we turned to gender equality in the Arctic. Our third event was on the oceans, the blue economy and innovation. And the last one we did was discussed indigenous knowledge and Western science. And now we are about to have a conversation on the role of storytelling and literature in Canada and Iceland. Storytelling is the vivid depiction of beliefs and ideas, experiences, and life through narratives that rouse emotions and insights. How do we address a world of big issues, huge changes in the nature of the North and related challenges? How do we confront history and what untold stories might guide us into the future? How does literature address identity, diversity, languages, and emotions? Can literature lead the way, or is it just another form of entertainment? We have a large task ahead, and we will start with a presentation from Dr. Birna Bjarnadóttir, a published author and former chair of Icelandic at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Today, she serves as the Stefán G. Stefánsson Research Specialist at the Vigdís Finnbogadóttir Institute of Foreign Language at the University of Iceland. Following Birna, we will hear from authors Andri Magnason and Dr. James Raffan that will lead us into the panel discussion moderated by author Eliza Reid, the First Lady of Iceland, which will be introduced by Ambassador Jeannette Menzies. Welcome, Birna. The floor is yours.
Ambassadors, First Lady of Iceland, and other fellow presenters, ladies and gentlemen. Well, the invitation to participate in this event arrived some time ago, and I would like to thank Ambassadors Jeannette Menzies and Hlynur Gudjonsson for this wonderful opportunity to say a few words on this occasion about Icelandic Canadian literature. A greater challenge than expected influenced the preparation for this brief presentation, though, for on March 10th, I fell on an icy path in Reykjavík city, resulting in a fractured shoulder. In fact, on that day, I had planned to be in Moscow, not Reykjavík, to see there in the new GS2 House of Culture, the performance piece Santa Barbara, also referred to as a living sculpture by the artist Ragnar Kjartansson and directed by the film director Ása Helga Hjörleifsdóttir. We know what happened on February 24th, 2022, and on the following day, the living sculpture Santa Barbara ceased to exist, and the opening exhibition in the House of Culture, curated by Ragnar Kjartansson and Ingibjörg Sigurjónsdóttir, another Icelandic artist, was understandably cancelled thanks to a decision of Ragnar Kjartansson. As fate would have it, the challenge faced was double-edged in the sense that it also served as a reminder of literature's forte across centuries and cultures. In literature, we can rely on the perception of the individual and the historic, and Icelandic Canadian literature is clearly shaped by this gift of perception, including those landmark works of literature that draw in part on major historic events, like the mass exodus from Europe to the Americas in the latter part of the 19th century, the immigrant settlement years during the processes of Canada's colonization, and the First World War. For an overview of the history of Icelandic Canadian literature, including an in-depth discussion on writers in the postmodern era like William or Bill Valgarðsson, Kristjana Gunnars, David Annason, Daisy Neyman's groundbreaking book, The Icelandic Voice in Canadian Letters, is highly recommended. In what follows, I'm going to highlight the significance of the perception of those writers who emigrated from Iceland during the mass exodus, or had parents among the pioneer settlers, also within the context of a landmark enterprise in our shared transatlantic history and culture. Here I'm referring to the University of Iceland's Stefán G. Stefánsson's Endowment Fund, which was established on April 20th, 2017, at the opening of the University of Iceland's Vigdís International Center for Multilingualism and Intercultural Understanding, a UNESCO Category 2 center. The endowment fund is named after Stefán G. Stefánsson, the Icelandic Canadian poet, farmer, essayist, pacifist, and social prophet, who was a pioneer in Wisconsin and Dakota territories until 1889 when he homesteaded in Markaville, Alberta. Born in 1853 in Skagafjörður, Iceland, he emigrated in 1873 from the town of Akureyri with the ship SS Queen. Stefán Vilberg Benediktsson, the grandson of Stefán G., who together with his wife Adriana contributed the founding endowment in the poet's memory, and other initial donations arrived from Heather Alda and William Ireland and Maria and Glenn Gray. Other major pledges and donations have been made by Donald K. Johnson, Árni Þorsteinsson, Susan Rodriguez Abbiati, Paul David Benediktsson, Stefán Robert Benediktsson, and Óskar Sigvaldason. We are equally grateful for the support from the government of Iceland, which provides us with the opportunity to enhance our long-standing collaboration with the University of Manitoba's Department of Icelandic Language and Literature on the fronts of teaching, publication, and research, and hopefully create collaborative research projects with other universities in Canada, including the University of Toronto and the University of Alberta. As was the case with writers like Helga Steinvör Baldvinsdóttir, who would write her poetry under the pseudonym Undína, the novelist, poet, short story writer, and playwright Jóhann Magnús Bjarnason, the poet and translator Jakobína Jónsson, and the poet and playwright Guttormur J. Guttormsson, who was born in 1878 in Canada, the son of Icelandic immigrants. Stefán G. only wrote in Icelandic, and all these writers could be said to manifest a lifelong attachment to and engagement with Icelandic language and culture and heritage. In their lives as immigrants and children of immigrants, however, the Icelandic language cannot set them free from the perception of the existential and historic complexities in the transatlantic region. Neither does the Icelandic language secure their works a uniform account of these complexities or of any given subject for that matter, thanks to the evident differences of their individual aesthetics and the varieties of their lived experiences. In addition to these authors' far-reaching linguistic and intercultural enterprise, their legacy serves also as a timeless reminder of the contribution of immigrant and émigré authors of literature throughout the history of world literature. In comparison with the Icelandic Canadian novelist Laura Goodman Salversson, who, like Guttormur, was born in Canada, late 19th century, a child of Icelandic immigrants, but who wrote her novels in English and received the Distinguished Governor General's Award twice, the works by the other writers, all written in Icelandic, may still be somewhat isolated from readers in the non-Icelandic part of the world. The beautifully lyrical and existential poetry of Undína is not too well known. The same is true of Jakobína Jónsson's striking poetry. Some of Guttormur's works have been translated, including his key poems that secured him the Poet of New Iceland title. And after being shrouded in a transatlantic enigma for decades, his extraordinary 10 plays were finally published in a bilingual publication in 2015, thanks to the permission of Heather Alda Ireland, his grandchild, and the splendid English translation by Elin Thordarsson and Christopher Crocker. And thanks not the least to Borga Jakobsson, readers have been able to make themselves familiar with the works of the wonderful novelist and short story writer Marilou Bjarnadóttir. But what about the poetry of Stefán G, some could ask? It earned him titles like the greatest poet of the Western world and Canada's leading poet. And it was Halldór Laxness who stated that Stefán G was one of the most powerful spirits of his time. The statement appeared on September 7, 1927 in Landnemin Mikli, the great settler, the eulogy Halldór wrote at the death of Stefán G for the Icelandic newspaper Heimskringla in Winnipeg. Halldór is, however, not too optimistic with regards to the reception. I don't know if the outer world will ever become aware of the universes this poet has created in the minds of Icelandic readers. If we are to rely on our experience, the treasures of our language are not easily translatable, Halldór wrote, he who later became world known, thanks in large part to the Nobel Prize in Literature he received in 1955. As the book Two Lands, One Poet manifests, a bilingual edition of a selection of poems by Stefán G, edited by Morea Gray and the person speaking, and which features an introduction by Jón Atli Benediktsson, president and rector of the University of Iceland. In his lifetime, Stefán G enjoyed excellent translations of his poem by, for example, the poet and his good friend Birna Bjarnadóttir. Through the 20th century and into the 21st, renowned translators of Icelandic literature like Bernard Sköller have also contributed their share to the visibility of the transatlantic treasure. Still, a poem like Vopnahlé, Battle Pause from 1915, which charts the horrific killing fields of Europe during the First World War with unspeakable profundity and has been referred to by John Ralston Saul in his foreword to Viðar Hreinson's Wakeful Nights, the groundbreaking biography on Stefán G, as the most important Canadian anti-war poetry. Well, this poem is scarcely known in the outer world. Evidently, Icelandic Canadian literature is brimming with a gift of perception of both the individual and the historic, and the legacy of those writers discussed serves as a timeless also reminder of the contribution of immigrant and emigre authors of literature in the history of world literature. In order to cultivate the immensely rich literary heritage from this side of the water, the University of Iceland established the Stefán G. Stefánsson Endowment Fund, its goal being to promote scholarly research in literature on the international stage in memory of Icelandic immigrant writers of North America. Takk fyrir, thank you.
Andri Magnason.
Yes, thank you. It's and congratulations on this day celebrating Iceland and Canada, and of course, in the terms of storytelling outside of Iceland, Canada, and maybe Denmark are the only countries where we really have some kind of status or literary history or some kind of immigration or some kind of larger reach of Icelandic literature. So talking about storytelling in the north, if you travel around Iceland, then you will you won't see many ruins. You won't see castles like in Italy or many historical places. But if you know the stories and the history, then you will notice that Iceland is actually covered with a layer of stories. And this layer can be up to like 2.7 meter thick at some places. So you have the homesteads that have still the names of the settlement time. And then each generation has left their stories, and we are so lucky that in oral tradition and in folklore and in the sagas, we have every single generation has kind of contributed to the story of each place. So we can have extremely scarcely populated places, but the literature from that place can be many volumes. So you could have a farm, and this farm would have a folklore story. It could have a troll. It could have hidden people living in the hill behind the farm. It could have events during any century of living in Iceland. Every single person that lived in the farm might have had a poem written about him or her, or a poem written about his or her death. So storytelling in Iceland has been very strong, and then you feel that storytelling connection then when Icelanders immigrate to Canada with nothing but stories. Then I thought it was almost overwhelming for like a town in Gimli, which is also normally you would not have a big origin story of a town somewhere in Northern America. It's just people would randomly come and they would make a small, like a small poor town that would then grow. But the origin story of Gimli by these people that settled in only that small town come more origin stories than I could think of in any town in the world, I think, because first they have this exodus, which is like in the Bible, this is like a nation leaving and finding a new place, which is also a bit like how Iceland was settled in the beginning, and people brought nothing but stories with them. And then they travel over Lake Winnipeg, and they're cut off in their barge, and they drift ashore. So the people kind of drift ashore, almost like the origin story of Iceland, the columns of Ingólfur Arnarson. So people drift ashore and they land on that rock, by this rock in Gimli, where a woman gives birth, which is kind of like Snorri Þorfinnsson and Plymouth Rock in the same place. And then these people from extreme scarcity and poverty kind of build up a village almost from scraps, and which is also a bit like the origin story of Iceland. And then this generation, they lose like almost all their children during the first winters. And so they actually lose 1/3 of the population, which is kind of the death toll Iceland had during each century of hardship. And an old man told me this story where they had to keep their children on the roof in Gimli and wait for the fall so they could bury them, which was kind of beyond traumatizing. So, and then these people that arrived in Gimli in 1875 went almost through the whole phase of modernity until they died with jumbo jets over their heads in their late 90s, maybe. So, so it's almost like this single generation went through like the whole origin stories of exodus, of following, establishing a new land until they die in complete modernity. So again, Gimli in Canada is a bit like, it's a very small town, and normally these towns don't have remarkable stories, but for some reason Gimli, maybe from the origin of storytelling, they have blown this place out of proportions in terms of how to tell stories. But then I was Googling Gimli, and I do notice that there is one story that I haven't read very much, which is the story of the people that were there before the Icelanders came. So there's yet another layer of mythology and stories to be told and to incorporate into the big story of Gimli, for example.
Thank you, Andri.
So storytelling is not a thing of the past. Storytelling is a eternally continuous kind of continuous need to explain, to phrase, to frame, to understand and revalue our history.
Thank you, Andri, for your words. James, you have to bring us.
Hello, good afternoon, good morning. I come to you as an accidental Canadian. My Scottish parents knew they needed to emigrate after the Second World War, and my dad had Navy friends in South Africa, Australia, and Canada, and none in Iceland, sadly, but they ruled out Australia and they flipped a coin, so the family story goes, and I became an accidental Canadian, and as such, have had a enduring fascination with the North, but my North in the early days was really shaped by literature. The writing of Jack London, To Build a Fire. I mean, people like Farley Mowat, that led to explorers' accounts of the north of Canada, including Samuel Hearne's epic story, The Journey to the Northern Ocean, which, as my kind of reading matured, I realized that journal of the explorer from the 1700s had been edited as a Gothic novel. And it reads much differently than other types of journals, but it was that novel that became, that led me to Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which that was a book that was informed by Samuel Hearne's travails, and that's why the book Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, starts in the Arctic. And it was Shelley's work that led me to creating this kind of world of the North, in worlds like Jules Verne's English at the North Pole. But it was a buildup of that energy that has sent me essentially to a lifetime of travel in the North. And when I say that, 40 plus consecutive years interrupted by a pandemic, travel that just began again with 2 weeks in Nunavut on a dog sled, which was absolutely fabulous. My temperature is just coming up again here. But I wanted to talk about an Icelandic Canadian connection that comes out of my writing. After many decades of learning in the North here, I wanted to meet the neighbors, and thought, well, wouldn't it be a great idea to travel around the world at the Arctic Circle to put a human face on climate change, a journey that began and ended, as it happens, in Iceland, the only place where new land is being created in the circumpolar world, if you like. But the only creature, that led to a book called Circling the Midnight Sun, but the only creature that was with me the entire way around the world, didn't matter what year, what season, there were always ravens, and I sketched them, I watched them, I marveled in their social abilities. And so I came to the end of this project, traveling around the world, and I'd met hundreds of people and been welcomed by many of them into worlds that really were somewhat similar to the Inuit worlds that I'd seen in Northern Canada. But I learned that, I mean, I went there to find nostrums for climate change, and it turns out everybody in the North and the circumpolar world, including in Iceland, are dealing with climate change. And that's something that Northerners have been doing for millennia, for generations. But so climate change is something people are adapting to. But I also learned that cultural change is a huge factor for many Northerners, sort of burying the last syllables of land nuanced language in the elders who are taking them to the grave, and sadly, burying the promise of the future in young people who are taking their own lives at unprecedented rates. But there were the ravens, there was the story. What did the ravens mean that I had met all the way around there? And it turned out that it was a kid in Grimsey who told me the story of Hugin and Munin, and of Odin, the Norse god, sending these two, he didn't see very well, I gather, and he sent these two ravens out to skulk around and see what they might see. Hugin coming from the Old Norse for thought, and Munin, I take it to be an Old Norse word, or coming from an Old Norse word meaning memory. And I started reading more about that. I mean, I went to as much as the sagas as I could see in Reykjavík, and the beautiful representation in the university there, to find out more about that and to read more about that. And I learned that Odin frets. What would happen if Hugin and Munin didn't come back? I mean, Hugin thought, if thought didn't come back, thought would have decided not to come back. And however bad that would be, if Munin didn't come back, that would be memory. And what would life be like without memory? And that led me to a conclusion for this book, From the Ravens Through the Sagas, to suggest that much of what I had heard on my way around the circumpolar world was about memory, of like collective human memory. And that was part of that. But and losing, and how important that would be if we lost that memory. But I want to just finish with an observation and an ache in my heart at the top of this this presentation, Madam First Lady, and I'm looking forward to this conversation, because I have many friends in the circumpolar world, including Iceland, but also Russia, indigenous and non-indigenous people who have different appetites than their leaders. And as this war has gone on, Russia is currently the chair of the Arctic Council, and that has effectively stopped any activities of the Arctic Council. And I really think that it now falls to the rest of us to keep those connections going, those circumpolar connections going, and the great traditions of literature that Birna and Andri have talked about, of the connections between Canada and Iceland. Those are the similar kind of connections that connect us to the other circumpolar countries. And if there was ever a time for writers and literature and creators to keep open those channels of communication and do exactly what we're doing this morning, that time is now, because it is without the political sphere, with respect to you two ambassadors on this, and somehow I see the diplomats as somehow outside the political realm, but it's up to the sort of the common people, the writers, the storytellers, to keep those connections alive in order for us all to move forward together.
Thanks for that, James, and Andri, also for your remarks. That is quite a powerful message to end with there, and you have launched us into a great platform to engage and discuss further. First, to introduce myself, my name is Jeannette Menzies. Jeg sendig her I Canada. Jeg så ánægð at være here I dag, and I'm saying my Icelandic because I see that my Icelandic teacher in Gimli is on this call, and so I just wanted to make sure she knows I'm still working away at the language. I'm simply going to take this moment to introduce Iceland's First Lady, and I'll be back at the end of our program. We are just thrilled today that Miss Eliza Reid is able to join us. She is between book tours in the US at the moment, but she's back in Iceland right now. She is Iceland's First Lady. She's a proud Canadian. She's an advocate for Icelandic literature abroad, founder of the Icelandic Writers Festival, which resumed this year in an in-person way, and I attended part of it and was pretty inspired by it all. She is the author of Secrets of the Sparakar, which was an immediate bestseller in Canada. And I understand not only has it been translated into, of course, Icelandic, it's also been translated into Korean, French, German, and Slovakian. I might be wrong on those, and there probably are more to come. But without further ado, I will pass the video and audio over to Eliza to moderate the panel. Thanks, Eliza.
Hi, everybody. I think my technology should be turned on now, although I'm looking at a giant picture of Ambassador Menzies still, but hello. But hopefully you can all see me at least, and Jeannette will maybe wave if she can't see me. But welcome, everybody. It is a great pleasure to have the opportunity to steer the dialogue this afternoon for the next half hour that we still have to be talking. As you can hear from Birna's lovely introduction, and obviously from Andri and James's words, storytelling is thankfully alive and well, and arguably more important now than ever before. So I know that we're going to have a great discussion. I want you all who are watching now, wherever you are, to start thinking of some good questions, because we absolutely want to get your involvement in this dialogue. But before we do that, I want to introduce you to a third member of our panel who will be taking part in the discussion. That is the writer and translator, Elin Thordarsson, who is based in Winnipeg, if I'm correct, or at least in Manitoba. And Elin, I'm going to ask you actually to just take a few moments to introduce yourself for me, please. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about the role of translations when we're talking here about storytelling. You know, Canada has so many languages spoken within its borders, in addition to our 2 official languages. And here in Iceland, you know, we have one primary language, and yet it's one that very few people speak. You see, I get to use the first person when I talk about both Canada and Iceland, which is great. But Elin, maybe you could say a few words as well as a brief introduction to yourself, please.
Sure. Hi, everybody. Well, first I want to thank everyone for inviting me to sit on your panel today. My name is Elin Thordarsson, and this morning I find myself in Winnipeg, Manitoba. I want to mention that this is a site on the lands of the Anishinaabe, Innu, and Dakota peoples, and it's the traditional homeland of the Métis people. I'm a writer and a translator, as Eliza mentioned, and I am currently the editor of Icelandic Connection. It's a literary journal published out of Winnipeg. This is a magazine that's been in continuous publication since 1942. And Eliza mentioned all the languages spoken in Canada. I was reminded immediately of a comment that a colleague had said about the map of Canada. When you're holding a map of Canada, you're holding a multilingual document in your hands. All the place names, Winnipeg is Winnipeg, it means murky waters, muddy waters. Toronto means something about where the trees stand in the water. These are Indigenous words. I translate from Icelandic into English, as Birna mentioned, bringing Guttormur's works, Guttormur Jóð Guttormsson's works out of the shadows into sort of a larger, to a larger audience, sort of raising him out of a provincial level readership into something much larger. Yeah, I don't know what else to say. I haven't translated much lately, other than people's diaries and letters these days. So yeah, I'm going to just leave it there.
Do you find, Elin, translating, say, the older diaries or people, you know, Icelanders who became Canadians, is that different for you than the works of, say, Icelanders who've always lived in Iceland in terms of the way they use language?
Well, the letters and the diaries that I look at are sent by people who cannot read them, but maybe they belong to their great grandparents. And so there is the language used in those are very, it's sort of an older style. It was the language that came over from Iceland and settled into the farms here in Manitoba, for the most part, is what I'm looking at. And yeah, I'm looking at an older form, I guess, of modern Icelandic.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask both first Andri and then James a question, and maybe then a question for all of you, and then I'm going to open it up. So all of you who are watching, stay tuned and keep your questions ready. Andri, of course, climate change and the climate crisis is an important theme in your work. I want to recommend your recent book on time and water for anybody who hasn't read it yet, which is an excellent read. How does storytelling, one of the themes then from today, really help to make huge and really daunting issues like the climate crisis somehow more relatable to us and somehow maybe more surmountable in that way?
Yes, thank you. So this has been my kind of major thing during the last years, maybe even more than 10 years. And that actually came, so of course, like everybody, I knew something about climate change, but I didn't feel maybe responsible for the issue. So I just kind of followed it and was, but didn't feel like I had permission to talk about it. because my father's a doctor, for example, and he hates it when laymen are giving medical advice. Like he wouldn't pull his hair more over the morning paper than when somebody tells people what to eat, or which has nothing to do with medicine. So I kind of had this very strong kind of feeling of the borders of professions. But then I met a climate scientist in Potsdam, and he asked me why I was writing about Icelandic nature and the highlands and areas threatened by development, but why didn't I write about the biggest issue of mankind, which was climate change? And I told him the story. I just didn't feel I had authority, and I was like, what if the science suddenly changes and I'm halfway through the book, and what do I do then? And he said, science isn't going to change overnight. So it's been studied for like decades. And if you're reading the media, you might think science will change overnight, but basically the foundations of this science are very thorough. And he said people don't understand data. And he was pulling his hair because he was producing very serious data, but nobody seemed to be relating to it. So he said, it's not only that you have authority to write, though you have permission to write about these things, it's actually your moral duty as a citizen, as a storyteller today, because people understand stories, they don't understand data. So this was something that I took to heart, and I was thinking about the stories that I could tell. And I remembered that my grandparents, and I was actually at the time constantly interviewing them about their founding trips of the Icelandic Glacial Research Society. So of course those stories come to heart. And then I could also use my grandmother to understand time, because what does 2100 mean for us? It has no meaning for us, but I could understand time by talking to my 98-year-old grandmother. So I could sit and have pancakes with 100 years. And I could ask these 100 years, are 100 years a long time or a short time? And she would tell me it's a very short time. And then it came to language, because if I tell you that in the next 100 years, the pH level of the world oceans will drop from 8.1 to 7.7, I'm telling something that is very dramatic, extremely large, like the most serious thing that I could say, 8.1 to 7.7. But still, the language does not encapsulate what I was saying. So how do you tell something? How do you talk about something that is bigger than language? And in there you can use mythology, you can use stories, you can storytelling can blow up things that collapse in data or in simple language.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andri. James, I want to ask you, you tell stories in so many different ways. You write, you do speaking engagements, you are exploring and engaging with different people. How do those, what are the different strengths and limitations of those various forms of storytelling? And what do you enjoy the most?
Madam Moderator, I'm sitting here thinking, how do you talk about something that's bigger than language? Andri, you've sent me in a spin, and I'm also sitting with you eating 100 years of pancakes. It's just fabulous. Thank you for that. Stories are told in many different ways and in many different contexts, and in a way, we're at a campfire here together, the 64 of us here. I could, somebody might do a dance about that. And so somebody might film it, somebody might write a story about it after. It might be prose, it might be poetry, but it's about basic communication. And although I'm drawn to words, I'm also interested in the evolution of voice in the North. And so, my last book was a portrait of humanity in 30 months in the life of a female polar bear on Hudson Bay. And that was a way of bringing climate change. Also fascinated, Andrei, about your notion of authority, but let's leave that for now. As who tells the story changes, and in the North, I mean, there was a time, in Samuel Hearn's day when Northerners were invisible, and people went from the South to the North and came back and told the stories. But there are Northerners telling the stories now. Like, I just spent 2 weeks on a dog sled with a 21-year-old kid who's got 1 foot in the traditions of his ancestors as a community hunter, and the other foot in TikTok, the world of digital communication. And he's the only person I know who's reporting on his polar bear hunts on Instagram, which is a very interesting thing. So, but what was I doing talking to him? I'm actually working for Polar Knowledge Canada on the idea of bringing scientists together with emerging and Northern artists to tell their stories on a stage. As a storyteller, I'm fascinated by the narrative and the places it leads, and certainly not bound by, especially as the digital world explodes, not bound at all by conventional notions of pages. Although I will say that pages, there's something about pages that endures, and it gives you a chance. You read it differently, you consume it differently, you relate to it differently. That's probably enough on that.
Thank you. Thanks, James. I have a couple more questions, but I think because we only have 15 minutes left, I would like to open it up to this wonderful group of people who are here to see if we have any questions from the audience. And also that puts my technical skills to the test, because if Per is here, he can maybe point out to me, how do I know if somebody wants to ask a question? Do they raise their hand, Per?
Yes, if they could just use the raise hand function, then we can see it in the audience survey, the audience list, or on the screen. So we'll keep an eye out and point out anyone who raises their hand.
I'm going to give people a second here and see if they raise their hand. And if not, I'll ask another question. I can't see it though, so you have to tell me if anybody has a question right now. Okay, while we're waiting, I am going to ask a question to the 3 panelists here. It's a little bit, it comes from my, what I like to call my small nation complex as both a Canadian and an Icelander, when, people want to know what people abroad think of Canada and vice versa. But so Elin and James, what do you think we can learn from Iceland when it comes to storytelling? And then Andri, the same question in reverse. But I'm going to start with Elin and James.
Elin, go ahead.
What can we learn about Iceland from storytelling?
What can we learn about storytelling from Iceland?
Okay. Well, I really connect with what Andri was saying earlier, that it's just storytelling for everyone, and in the Icelandic context is never ending, and it's how we understand ourselves and our places, and it's how we understand each other or our families. Everything becomes a story. Your entire life is this story that you tell to yourself and to others, and your death, I guess, or death is maybe a story that just happens to other people. Yeah, it's a big question on a big topic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And James, anything to add?
I was really struck by Andri's notion that Iceland is covered with a layer of stories 2.7 meters thick. I love how general and specific that is, but that message, that written into the landscape are the scratches of human striving, of human ingenuity, of human relationships with the land, that that are important but often overlooked. And Canada is a young country. You know, my parents talked about digging in the ground in the UK, and they would find, you know, layers and layers and layers of history and bricks and metal and all that sort of stuff. Canada, much of it is young and seemingly empty of people, but still, those stories that are written into the landscape in a whole variety of ways. And in our case, you know, of Indigenous people going back, you know, millennia, thousands and thousands of years, those stories, the way in which Iceland, or just the way that Andri characterized, you know, the idea that a farm could have folklore, a troll and hidden people, and just, you know, but they're not jumping out at you from a billboard or from the television set. You have to go there, you have to dwell there, you have to listen. And if that is an Icelandic notion, which is introduced by an Icelander in this call, then I think that is something that that more Canadians could take heed of.
Thank you so much. And Andri, anything that we in Iceland can pick up from the Canucks?
From the Canadians, yeah, okay, yeah. So, well, I think, of course, Canada is showing us, like, what has impressed me with Canada is kind of, well, I'm not local in Canada, but I've had my play in Toronto, so I've been quite a lot in Canada, and I was actually, and maybe people at home might have a different opinion, but I felt like immigration was and identity was handled quite well, actually, with how people were allowed to keep their languages and encouraged to continue telling their stories in their home languages. But I thought I was throwing this to home. So my idea was that like storytelling and science, for example, in Icelandic in the Icelandic context. So you would be told that that this canyon in the north was the horseshoe of Odin's horse. But actually it was made in a glacial outburst in 10,000 years ago. So it was like folklore and science didn't contradict each other, but it was amplifying each other. So using folklore, using traditional knowledge to actually amplify science or make it more interesting. So it wasn't like these were two worlds colliding. They were always told simultaneously. So this is a troll that was just eating a priest on his way to his or her lover. But actually it's a basalt column from a volcano before the waves kind of swept everything surrounding away. So it didn't contradict each other. It was just coming together. So, and what I think also gives me confidence that I can tell my stories in Icelandic, which is a very small community globally, but I can still speak to a very much broader audience, thanks to people like Elin, that that are taking our stories and translating them to another audience. So yeah, that was my take on this.
Thank you, Andri. We do have a question from Anne Barker. And I can read your question, but if you want to sort of say it so we get to hear your voice, you're welcome to demute yourself and decamera yourself for a minute if you want.
Sure, thank you. And thank you very much for organizing this panel. My question was just, I'm wondering if there's a need for scientists themselves to learn to become storytellers, or is that a bad idea? And also what can, second part to that is, what can scientists learn from Icelandic and Indigenous Canadian storytellers to do so, if it's not a bad idea?
Thank you. Anybody want to tackle that one first of our three panelists? James, go ahead.
My friend Eddie Carmack, who's an oceanographer and a serious scientist, talks about the social obligation of a scientist to tell their stories more broadly. I think scientists should embrace that social responsibility to tell their stories. And in fact, this project I'm working on with Polar Knowledge Canada has taken me into the world of science. And they do have, scientists have wonderful stories to tell, some of them very elegant scientific stories, but other stories that are kind of integrated into place. The trouble is that science itself as a discipline does not, I find, does not reward that kind of storytelling. It's this notion of detachment, objectivity, kind of the vice grips of positivism on the creativity of the scientist to release the data. But I'm thinking that as the world goes forward, I mean, Polar Knowledge Canada in some ways are wringing their hands to say, all this science is going on and nobody knows about it. Well, part of the problem is that nobody seems to be rewarding scientists and telling those stories. So I'm actually trying to get scientists to embrace that. But what I've run into is the fact that in order to be a successful scientist, there's nothing in your world that would give you any sense of reward for telling stories that way, unless you're like Eddie Carmack, where you get to the end of your career and citizen science becomes something that's become a priority for him because he has nothing to prove scientifically. So it's a important part of the conversation in any country, particularly now as climate change, our own effluent is sort of taking us over.
Thank you very much, James. Elin or Andri?
Yeah, like coming from what James was talking about, I've had some thoughts about this regarding scientists, because I deeply respect science, and I have received lots of help from scientists, but I've often felt the discipline of science has kind of maybe I'm using a too big word, but kind of dehumanized them, or like the need to be objective has maybe gone to the extreme of erasing their persona, and so just things like storytelling, or just poetry or emotions, or just saying that you love birds if you're a scientist of birds. I once saw a scientist and somebody asked, now this species is going extinct or something, or this glacier is melting, and he said, I'm a scientist, I don't have an opinion on that. I'm just observing what is happening and telling you what is happening. And I was thinking, because you wouldn't have that in a doctor. A doctor wouldn't say, you have cancer, but I don't care. So I was thinking why they had to erase their empathy and their kind of, and I think that might be one of the reasons why some of the science has distanced from the public, and maybe other forces taken the torch where maybe science left it.
That's excellent points. Thank you, Andri. Elin, did you have anything you wanted to add to the question?
I could add that I work at the public library downtown in Winnipeg. It's called the Millennium Library. It's the hub, and out back we have a green space called Millennium Park, and the city horticulturalists got together with local elders, Indigenous elders, and in order to put in a medicine garden back there. And once they received the traditional teachings on the 4 medicines, they were able to create a very beautiful garden space, which you can go in and you can take what you need, and including information to then impart that knowledge to the rest of the public. It was just sort of a nice modern overlap, I thought, and a really reconciling moment for like the city scientists working with Indigenous knowledge to create a space for everyone to access this traditional knowledge, and use the plants if you need it. If you need to look at the sweetgrass, you have to get close to see that this is sweetgrass. It's purple at the bottom. You just have to get in and touch it all. And the tobacco is sticky. And if you need it, cut some and take some. It's a lovely gesture at the public library.
Thank you so much. I think that's a beautiful and lovely story. We have 4 minutes left according to my clock before the end, and I know that Jeannette Menzies, the ambassador, would like to say a few closing remarks. So does anybody have a pretty quick question that they want to ask at the end here?
Hi, I'd like to.
Okay.
Marilou McPhedran. I'm a senator for Manitoba, and my question is really more of an invitation, and that is to understand better by getting more information, perhaps also stories about the early days, the early settlement in Manitoba and the connections with the Indigenous peoples. My understanding is that there was saving of Icelandic lives by Indigenous peoples, but I haven't heard that today. Thank you.
Excellent point. Anybody want to address?
Can I address that? At the New Iceland Heritage Museum, I'm Julianna Roberts, the executive director, and our newest permanent exhibit here at the museum pays tribute to John Ramsey, who was an Indigenous fellow who traveled to Winnipeg and brought a doctor back to the colony when smallpox had hit. So we do have an exhibit telling that story, if that helps you.
Thank you very much. And I don't know, perhaps if there's a way afterwards on the mailing list to share any kind of websites or details that people might want to get to find further information on some of the material that's been discussed. But I think now we have 2 minutes left. So I will say tack fyrir mig, as we would say in Iceland, and now hand the floor over to Ambassador Jeannette Menzies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eliza. And I fortunately talk very quickly and I have 2 minutes left. So I will end by thanking our First Lady for joining us and moderating this very exciting session today. Thanks to my colleague, Ambassador Gudjonsson, for this collaboration on this series of webinars. 2022, I think that's the year right now, marks the 75-year anniversary of diplomatic relations between Canada and Iceland. You will see the beautiful image that we have behind me. I walk around town with this behind me, so if you see me, that's what I talk about all the time. I wanted to just briefly flag this really exciting initiative that's happening next month. The government of Canada is gifting 75 book titles to Iceland via the Reykjavík Public Library and the Akureyri Public Library on a range of different themes, including the North and the Arctic, reconciliation and diversity, inclusion, gender equality, and there's another topic, climate change as well, of course. I wanted to just, in the 1 minute that remains, show a few covers of some of these books. So if any of you are in Iceland, I encourage you after June to go and look for these book titles, because there'll be 75 in each library and it's going to be pretty exciting. The first one, White Settler Reserve, New Iceland and the Colonization of the Canadian West by, sorry, this is difficult, Ryan A. Ford. This is one of them that will be in the libraries. Here's another one. This is a random selection. The Right to Be Cold by Sheila Watt-Cloutier, one of my favorites. Five Little Indians. This is one I've been giving as gifts to my interlocutors here in Iceland. An excellent book by Michelle Good. Here we are, Circling the Midnight Sun by James Raffan, who's joined us, and we've enjoyed listening to James. You can read more about his book through the library here. Devant ma maison, a children's book that I'm happy to highlight. We have a number of French language books that will appear in the libraries. And the Thora series by Julian Johnson, which I'm excited that we will have at the libraries as well. And then finally, I picked this one to show you because I just love the cover. Sunshine Sketches of a Little Town. Anyway, that's a nice way to end. I just think that cover is fabulous. Thank you all for joining us today. Tack fyrir mig, and we look forward to seeing you at our future webinars. And thanks again. And please fill out the survey that Per has included in the link if you're able to. Merci.